Good morning. We're awake now. Great to be with you. My name is Jeremy. I want to welcome those of you who are watching or listening online. So glad that you guys are a part of this as well. I am stoked. We're diving into week 2 of this series we began last week called Them versus Us. If you missed last week, you can go online and catch up to that, kind of set the premise of where we're going. But today I want to invite you, if you got your Bibles, we're going to be in Ruth chapter 1. I'm going to give you some time to find it. If you have a Bible or Bible app on your phone, you may be going, Ruth. Where exactly is that? That's toward the beginning. So go all the way back to the beginning. Joshua, Judges, Ruth. You'll be there. I'll give you a few moments to find your spot there. And in this series, what we've been talking about is our tendency to create a them around us, right? A them can be anyone who looks differently than you, acts differently than you, you don't understand, you just think are weird, whatever. And we're so quick to create thems all around us, and this is a problem. Now, as I was working on the message this week, I discovered something. It's not just a unique problem to humans. Do you know that animals also struggle with including people, or including other animals, I guess, and even insects struggle with this as well. In fact, I learned something about bees this week. You may know, may not know. Do you know that bees can actually get drunk? That's not even the funniest part of the story. Bees can get drunk on fermented fruit or flowers, especially when it gets hot. And so you literally can imagine these bees, swerving around, in the air, like trying to find the hive. And here's what's crazy. When they get back to the hive, evidently in bee culture, it's a very strict no drinking policy. Because the bees do not like when these drunk bees come back. And they have, again, these are all things I learned. They have guard bees, which just sounds kind of intense, right? And so they have these guard bees that are at the edge of the hive, and when the drunk bee comes in, the guard bees are like, whoa, you're not bringing that in here. And they're so, about keeping everything, pure in the hive that they will not allow these drunk bees to bring back what they've got. Now you might go, wow, that's really intense that, these bees are keeping out these drunk bees and won't let them in. Oh, that's not the craziest part. This is for real. Do you know what these guard bees do next? When they see the drunk bee, to make sure that the drunk bee doesn't get in and that the drunk bee never does this again, they bite their legs off. I kid you not. I read this and I went, nah, that can't be true. So I looked it up and watched a video of guard bees biting off these drunk bees' legs and was so traumatized by it that I'm going to show it to you now. Check this out. Just kidding. Literally, I had to go for a walk after I watched this video. I was like, whoa, that is dark stuff. Come on, bees, that's messed up. And so I thought, you know what? This isn't just a human problem. This is just a thing that we do as living creatures, I guess. I don't even know where you would draw the line here, but we just love this. We love excluding people, and for all kinds of reasons. And again, there's lots of reasons, and some of the reasons, as we explore in the series, you may go, no, that's a good reason to exclude people, and we're just challenging that as we go. We're trying to figure out, all right, what do we need to learn about this? Now, each week in the series, what we're doing is we're going, okay, how did it start with one of these themes, and then how is it going now as we learn more about the heart of God? And so today, I want to tell you how it started. So keep your spot in Ruth chapter 1. I'm going to read a passage out of Deuteronomy for you, which is before even Ruth, and I'm going to set up a theme that then we're going to see is addressed in the book of Ruth, okay? So Deuteronomy 23, which is the book that, I'm sure you've spent a lot of time in Deuteronomy this week because it's super fun. Deuteronomy 23, all the rules, all the regulations. Here's what we find out. No Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants for 10 generations may be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Now, I wouldn't read the 10 generations there part literally. That's like saying for a long time, indefinitely, forever, if you will. We do not allow these people in. So basically, Ammonites, Moabites, bad. God said it for a long time, generation after generation after generation. These nations, why, God? These nations did not welcome you with food and water when you came out of Egypt. And now there's hell to pay. Instead, they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor in distant Aram Naharaim to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to listen to Balaam. He turned the intended curse into a blessing because the Lord your God loves you. And then check out this mandate. As long as you live, you must never promote the welfare and prosperity of the Ammonites or Moabites. Woo! God is ticked. I mean, do not make God mad, because for 10 generations, as long as you live, you are now to exclude these people. And if you just read this passage, you're like, all right, I don't know other context. If you just read this passage, you're like, wow, God really doesn't like the Ammonites and the Moabites. Now, I want to just remind you of something we talked about last week that's going to sound a little bit contrary to this. Last week we talked about that we are quick to create them. It's like a skill you and I have. But God creates in us. And we find this holistically throughout the scriptures. Now, the problem is you read a passage like this and you're like, that doesn't sound like God's creating in us at all. And I would say, I agree with you. So we're going to take a step back. We're going to zoom out a little bit to figure out what's going on here. When we have passages like this that we go, whoa, that is a hard line in the sand. God doesn't like those people. What I want to suggest to you is that this reveals more about God's people than it does about God. Now, God's in a covenant relationship with these people, okay? But this reveals more about where they're at than it does about God. And hopefully that'll make sense as we go. But if you have Deuteronomy 23, and you were raised with this, and you've heard this, and this is like, okay, thus saith the Lord, this would be a safe line for you to draw in the sand. We do not like these people. Like, very clear, if you're Ammonite, Moabite, we do not like you. But on top of that, we have spiritual justification for not liking you. So imagine if you met a Moabite, and you're like, I really don't like this person. You're like, not only do I not like you, but God likes me for not liking you. Like, God blesses me for not, you are like, the worst kind of not liking someone, right? Like, I am spiritually justified. Now, before we move on, because it's quick to dunk on people in the Old Testament. Before we move on, let me ask you this question. Have you ever felt spiritually justified for not liking someone? Like, can you relate with this feeling? And I think okay, there's this person, or maybe it's a group of people, maybe it's a stereotype of people, and you go, I don't like them. Now, usually what you do, if you're spiritually justified, you go, okay, let me give you a really good reason why, right? And so what's the good reason? Well, we focus on sin. Well, they are involved in this sin, and because they're involved in this sin, I am spiritually justified for not liking them. Now, notice, almost always the sin in question is a sin you don't struggle with. Just take note of that. These people struggle with that sin that I don't struggle with, and therefore, I am spiritually justified because I love God. Because I'm a good Christian, because I value the truth. All these things, these are all spiritual justifications for not liking someone. And so I just want to suggest, as we read this passage, we learn about how the Israelites treated the Moabites. We can find ourselves here in this, right? We can understand what it feels like to spiritually justify not liking someone, a reason why we create a them. So that's how it started. You have this very clear premise, Deuteronomy 23. The Israelites would have been raised with this as a foundational idea for generations to come. We do not like the Moabites. Now, let's see how it's going, right? So I want to show you the book of Ruth. And we're going to read just a couple of different passages, if you're with me in Ruth. Pay attention to the setup of this story, because everything that happens in the story is really important in the setup. It says, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab. This is where Moabites come from, taking his wife and his 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. But then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. And then verse 4, catch this. The 2 sons married Moabite women. This is where we go, oh, no! not the Israelite boys. No, they're marrying Moabites. Like this is the reaction. If you know Deuteronomy 23, bad things just happen, right? Like, whoa. This is not good. The Moabites are bad. We read Deuteronomy 23. We know this. And yet, that's the setup of the story, that her sons marry Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. The sons died. This left Naomi alone without her two sons or her husband. Okay, so this is, I know, a lot of names we just threw at you. Let's get the story recapped. An Israelite couple moves to Moab with their two sons. The husband dies. The sons marry Moabite women. The sons die. Then this leaves Ruth with her two daughters-in-law. Orpah leaves. Ruth stays with Naomi. So you have Naomi, the mother-in-law, Ruth, her daughter-in-law. Their sons, Naomi's sons and her husband have all died. Now, in that culture, your husband or your son or whatever was your kind of cultural collateral. This is how you existed, how you survived. To be a female on your own was to be a very vulnerable person. Now, you multiply that by 2, you have 2 females on their own. All the men in their family have died. Okay, so you have these 2 women, very vulnerable. What are they going to do? How are they going to survive? That's kind of the setup of the book of Ruth. Now, if you're with me, let's go to chapter 2, and we see, okay, what are they going to do? That they've lost their men, they're vulnerable, they're going to have to figure out a way to make it. It says, now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. One day, Ruth the Moabite, which, by the way, I love that the text calls her that. As if you didn't connect that she was a Moabite already from what was said, it now calls her that. Ruth the Moabite, right? Because, remember, Deuteronomy 23, we don't like Moabites. So when you read about Ruth, the author is reminding you, remember Ruth? Remember where she's from? It's Ruth the Moabite, okay? When she said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. Naomi replies to her mother-in-law, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. Now, they're both in this precarious situation. I want you to notice what they're doing. Notice what they're not doing, right? Ruth decides, hey, I got to do something. I've got to go figure out something. So she goes and hey, I'm going to try this. She's not just sitting around hoping things get better, right? She doesn't turn to Netflix and ice cream and Uber Eats and hey, this will just make me feel better. No, she's I'm going to go out. I'm going to go try something. We'll figure out if this works. This reminds me of a letter that was written by Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist. He said it like this. He was counseling someone. When one is in a mess like you are, which I would love to know the context of whoever he's writing to, your life sucks, right? When one is in a mess like you are, one must do the next thing with diligence and devotion. Everyone has to do it the hard way, and always with the next, the littlest, and the hardest things. So his advice to someone who's clearly going through something was, look, just go figure out something you can do. And it might be little, it might seem insignificant, but it might be really difficult. It might be really hard to do. Now, maybe you're not super familiar with Swiss psychiatrists, but you're you know what, Jeremy? That kind of sounds familiar to me. There's a wave of that that's vaguely familiar. You may have heard of this idea. It was popularized in a movie that maybe you've seen. Disney made this famous in Frozen 2, right? When Anna says, just do the next right thing. Right? There's a whole song and the whole thing, right? That's how you get out of it. You just do the next right thing. That's essentially what Carl Jung was saying. Hey, you just got to figure out, okay, when life is overwhelming, when things are bad, what's the next right thing you can do? What I find fascinating in the book of Ruth is how Ruth decides to do the next right thing. What she decides to do is okay, I'm going to go look for kindness. I'm going to go look for it. Now, you and I today, if we say, hey, someone's having a really hard time, what should they go do? You probably wouldn't say, go look for someone to be kind to you. You'd be like, that's dumb. That's not going to help. That's naive. Like, why would you tell someone to go look for kindness? That's literally what the text says. Go back. We just read this. This is Ruth 2, verse 2. Let me go out in the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who's kind enough to let me do it. Ruth's like, I'm just going to go see if anyone is kind. And if anyone is kind, then that'll help us out. Then we'll be able to navigate this. Now, what's cool about this is a direct connection to the way that the text describes Ruth being kind to her mother-in-law. In fact, when their husbands die, Naomi says to both Orpah and Ruth, like, hey, go back to your families now. You don't owe me anything. I know I'm a widow now, but like go and do your own thing. And this is how Ruth chapter 1, verse 8, it says, but on the way, Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. So you have this idea of like Ruth is incredibly kind in the way that she is stuck around with Naomi. And now, Naomi's saying, hey, may the Lord reward this. And now a chapter later, you have Ruth looking for this reward, saying, hey, I was kind. Maybe God will reward me with kindness as well. And I love this idea. And I think this is such an important part of following Jesus, of looking for kindness. And you may go, well, that's just so silly. Who's going to go around looking for kindness? And I love one of the things my friend Scott says. He says, God answers prayers with people. See, sometimes we don't even want to pray for kindness because like, well, what is God going to supernaturally come down and do something weird? Maybe God's just going to nudge someone. It's going to prompt someone, going to put you on someone else's heart when God knows, hey, you're going through something. And maybe someone else reaching out to you is actually the kindness of God and the response to something that you prayed about. See, I love this emphasis on kindness. I like to suggest, in fact, that kindness is crucial to Christianity. And in fact, you can say that's like a sub-theme of this entire series. Well, how do we have less thems? Be kind to people. When we live with kindness, we would not have as many us versus them moments. Well, why do I think kindness is so crucial? Because kindness is the way God treats us. Now, you find this. This is Romans chapter 2. Paul says this in verse 4. Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that his kindness is intended to turn you from your sin? How is God going to turn people from their sin? Well, we think, well, he's going to shame you. He's going to pour out his wrath on you. He's going to cause everything you do to fail. He's going to make you miserable. He's going to make you feel awful. That's how God turns people from sin. No, Paul goes, can't you see that it's God's kindness? God leads with kindness. That's what God does. Like, hey, if you're in the middle of sin and I want to turn you from sin, I'm going to lead with kindness toward you. And I would like to suggest this is probably one of the more, underrated verses in the New Testament that most Christians don't seem to think is a thing. Like the kindness of God is how God's big strategy to turn people toward him, like kindness. And if we believed that, you and I would lead with kindness to more people around us. Even the people that we think, no, they're in sin, do what God does and be kind to them. Lead with kindness and watch what happens. It's such a huge part of following Jesus. And it's a huge part of this story. Now jump down to verse 8 in chapter 2. It says, Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you're thirsty, help yourself to the water that they have drawn from the well. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness? She asked. I'm only a foreigner. Yes, I know, Boaz replied, but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and your mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. See, Ruth's act of loyalty, her act of kindness to her mother-in-law, is now being rewarded in ways she never could have envisioned, in ways she never could have anticipated. This is one of the things we learn from stories like this, is oftentimes when we're in a mess ourselves, we think, all right, here's where I'm at. That's the outcome I need. How do I get from here to over there? And if you're anything like me, a lot of times you're like, I can't get those dots to connect. Like, I don't know how this leads to that. I just can't figure it out. And so we try really hard to figure that out. But let me give you an encouragement. If you are following Jesus, you're not responsible for the outcomes in your life. You're not. That's Jesus. What you're responsible for is just faithfulness in the moment. What does God ask you to do? Do that. And wherever that leads, whatever road that takes you down, that's ultimately up to God. Which means as Christians, we don't play the way the world plays. We don't say, yeah, the ends justify the means. No. As Christians, the means are all we have. Like we just focus on the means, because the ends, that's God's business. What God ultimately does with our story is God's. We are called to be faithful. We are called in that moment. I love the way that Carolyn Custis James in her book on the book of Ruth says it. She says, we are not the masters of our own destinies. We are called to plan and strategize, to work and live active lives, to attempt things that are beyond us, and tackle challenges that stretch us to the limit. Yet, the outcome of our efforts, even our ability to exert ourselves, is always in God's hands. That ultimately, it's never just about us achieving some ends. It is about us learning to be faithful to what God has put in front of us and learning to trust God in radically new ways. Now, one of the reasons why the book of Ruth, I don't have time to read the whole book. It's a fascinating story. One of the reasons why it's so fascinating is it does not play out as you would envision. And in fact, you read through Ruth, you're like, how on earth is this story going where this story is going? It just doesn't make sense. It's not what you'd anticipate. In fact, one philosopher named Charles Taylor, he describes the narrative of Ruth as an alternative social reality. I love that phrase. That this story is like an alternative social reality. Like, what's going on here? Why is this playing out? The reason why is because Ruth is just worried about being faithful. She's not worried about the outcomes. She knows she can't control it. So because she's so faithful, these outcomes that make no sense start popping up. And you go, how did you get to that? And there is no way to connect the line outside of God. Like, I don't understand how she got from here to, she didn't, right? She was faithful, and God did what only God can do. And if you want to follow Jesus, your life should become an alternative social reality. People look at you and go, how on earth did you get there? How on earth has that happened to you? How on earth are you experiencing that? What? They look at us like, I don't know. All I know is this is what I felt like I was supposed to do. I did it, and then I ended up here. And it's not all blessings and, hey, this is going to be great. Sometimes you end up with outcomes and you're like, I'm definitely blaming God for this one, right? I have been there as well. But sometimes you just go, I don't know. I'm just going to be faithful to what God is giving me in the moment. And ultimately, I'm trusting God with the outcome. Now, here's a question. I'm going to make this personal for each of us. What would it look like for you to be faithful to God in this moment? Like in your story, in your situation, whether you're like, yeah, I'm overwhelmed as well, or maybe you're like, I'm doing great. What would it look like for you to be faithful to God in this moment? Have you asked? Have you spent time pondering that with God? Going, God, all right, I'm going to give you my imagination. Where would you take it? What do you want me to envision I could do? And maybe some of you, maybe you're like, oh yeah, no, I know what it is, because God keeps asking me. And we've been kind of going back and forth for a while, and there's that thing, he keeps nudging me, keeps prompting me, and I keep saying no. Maybe it's been days, weeks, months, and you're going back and forth, and that thing, God's like, just do this. You're like, yeah, but I don't know how that gets me there. And God's like, don't worry about it. Just do this. Yeah, but if I just do that, I'm asking you. Just be faithful in that moment. And maybe you're wondering, if I'm faithful in this moment, I'm going to lose everything that I want over there. God's like, just trust me. Just trust me. Just trust that I might be able to do it. See, sometimes it's not complicated. It's not, I got to solve this riddle. It's just, am I willing to do the thing that God is asking me to do? It's kind of like working out. Hey, if someone says, I want to get in really good shape, how do I do it? Guess what? You all know the answer to that question. Every single one of you do. You eat better food and you move your body more. It's literally not more complicated than that. You want to get in better shape, eat better food, work out more, right? Well, no, but I don't want to do those things, right? I want a pill. I want a video series. I want a patch. I want like something awesome to do. Like give me a cleanse. Like we don't want just the obvious things because it's the same thing following Jesus. How do I achieve this? You just do what God wants you to do. Like when God puts something in front of you, you're like, okay, I'll do it. And you just trust God with the outcome. And it's so often I have found that even when we know what God has asked us to do, we're like, I don't know. Maybe not. And we just kind of sit in this area. It reminds me when I was a kid, we were on family vacation one summer, and I had taken this medication for, I don't remember for what, but I had read the dosage wrong. And so I was like doing way more of it than I was supposed to, and I was like constantly having stomach aches for a couple days while I was figuring out like what is wrong with me, and like, oh, I didn't read the directions right. So at this point, we're traveling on a road trip, and we were in, I don't know where, somewhere in the desert of Texas, which I know really narrows it down, but somewhere in the desert, we were driving. I'm in the backseat, our family of 4. And I'm just sicker than a dog. I mean, my stomach hurts, and I realize I'm going to throw up all over this car, and it's not going to be pleasant because we're all stuck here in the middle of the desert. And so I say to my dad, hey, Dad, can you pull over? I have to go throw up. And he's like, okay. So pulls the car over. I get out. It is just scorching hot. I walk over, probably next to some cactus, I'm just like, oh, I just bend down. I'm like, all right, here we go. I'm just going to let it all out. And then I don't know if it was like moments or minutes or how long, but I couldn't throw up. You ever had that moment where you're like, you need to throw up, but you can't throw up? Some of you are hardcore and you'd have like, just gag yourself. Can't do that, so I'm not that guy. So I'm just sitting there and I'm like, oh, I feel so bad. I'm so sick. I'm so miserable, but I can't throw up. Nothing's happening. What am I going to do? And so I'm having this moment, again, all this conversation happening, and I hear a car door open. I look over, and I see my dad walking to me. I'm like, okay, this is going to be good. My dad's going to help me navigate this, encourage me, help me figure out how to get through this. My dad comes walking over to me, and just simply without saying, he just kind of bends down, stands next to me, and then he says something to me that I've never forgotten. I'm 40 years old now. I literally remember exactly what he said to me. He bent down and he said, son, I need you to throw up or get back in the car. Then he walked off, just like that. Now, as a son, as a kid, was that what I wanted to hear? No, not at all. I'm like, what? Throw up or get back in the car? Like, I'm sick. Do you see me? I'm sweaty. I'm on the side of the road. Like, I'm wallowing in my misery. Like, this is not good. And then I kind of realized, like, he's not wrong. I mean, he's kind of a jerk, but he's not wrong. You know what I mean? Like, those really are my two options. I can throw up or I can get back in the car. And so literally I sat there and I'm like, fine. I'm going to show him. I'm going to get back in the car, and I'm not going to throw up. And I don't know why I thought that would show him, but like I should have puked in the car to show him. But I got back in and, just decided, all right, I'm not going to throw up. And I think back to that moment because like that really is so often where I go, like emotionally, like me and God, I'm like, well, yeah, I know you want me to do this, but like my tummy hurts, or like I don't want to, or like what would happen? And we could just get stuck in that moment. Some guys like, just do it. Let's do that thing that I'm prompting you to do. Stop worrying about all the outcomes. Stop worrying about how you're going to make this whole thing work out the way you want to work out, and just be faithful to what I've put in front of you. And when you do, you get to live this alternative social reality. This story that Ruth got to live, it's like, how does this all work out? It's because you just trust God. And so you get to the end of Ruth, and I want to show you, as we wrap up the story, I want to show you what Boaz says to Ruth. Okay, so Boaz is this Israelite relative of her father-in-law, and it says this. He says this to her, may the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done. Whoa. What happened to Deuteronomy 23, Boaz? What happened to all Moabites are bad? For generations, do not support them. As long as you live, do not encourage them. Do not reward them. Boaz is doing exactly the opposite. So if all you had was Deuteronomy 23, you might go, God hates Moabites. But then you get to stories like Ruth and you go, does he? Because this seems to be the opposite of that. So how do we make sense of that? Well, let me give you a little spoiler alert. I encourage you to read the book of Ruth this week. But the book ends with Ruth and Boaz getting married. And they have a son. Yay, happy ending. But it's a little bit more interesting than that. Because at the end of Ruth, Ruth ends with a genealogy, which I know is everyone's favorite thing whenever you get to in the Bible. These genealogies, lists of names, like what's the point? Well, there is a point. And the genealogy of Ruth at the end of the book is an interesting way to end this story. So you've got Ruth the Moabite, who ends up with Boaz the Israelite. And then you find out, and they named their son Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David. David. That name sounds familiar. Oh, that's King David. One of the most famous and influential Israelites of the entire Old Testament is a grandson of Ruth's son, Obed. That is one heck of a way to end the book of Ruth. Oh, you know this Ruth the Moabite that everyone in Deuteronomy 23 is like, no, not her. Yeah, she's going to be directly an ancestor to David. Whoa, that is cool. You want to know what's even better? You get to the New Testament. Guess what? The New Testament begins with a genealogy. Matthew chapter 1, another list of names. Why? Because the names are significant. In Matthew chapter 1, you get to verse 5, it says, Boaz was the father of Obed. Who was his mom? Oh yeah, his mother was Ruth, and Obed was the father of Jesse. Continues that, like, yeah, we already read that. Why is it being repeated again? Because Matthew chapter 1 is the genealogy not of King David. Matthew chapter 1 is the genealogy of Jesus. Which means that Jesus was a descendant of Ruth the Moabite. Wait, but I thought all Moabites were bad. I thought that, what's going on? You see, God is always inviting us forward. When you and I want to create a them, God's like, no, that's not big enough. Come on. I want to show you what I'm doing. And if you will say yes to God, if you will start to trust God in this way, you will begin to realize God is inviting you forward in radical ways as well. Let's pray together. Jesus, descendant of Ruth the Moabite, we are in awe of how you use all sorts of people who don't fit the part. We're in awe of a story about a Moabite woman who should not have been blessed, should not have been included, should not have figured into this story in any way, and yet here we are talking about her in the line of the great Israelites and of the person we choose to follow today. And so we just pray that you would help this perspective change the way we treat people around us, that we would lead with kindness the way you lead with kindness. And when we find ourselves in situations where I don't know what to do here, I don't know how to get this outcome, that we would just trust you with those results, that we would just learn to be faithful. Jesus, would you use people like us in this way to transform this community with kindness, with an alternate social reality of us that makes no sense to them as we gather around you. Jesus, we invite you to move us forward. We pray this in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, amen.
During this time, we go into a time we call communion. And this is not supposed to be something religious or something that's just functional. It's supposed to be something relational, where you are reminded, or I am reminded, that this isn't a us versus them mentality moment. This is just a welcoming moment where Jesus shows us his kindness by wanting to even sit with us at the table. In this moment at the table, as we commune with Jesus, we remember specifically his sacrifice on the cross. And he asks us to do this so that we wouldn't forget. And I don't think it's ever supposed to be a guilt trip, that you would just feel bad about thinking about Jesus and the cross. No, that you would feel loved. That he died for you and I, not based on how good we were last night, yesterday, or the week before. He didn't die for us because of how good we were. He died for us and loved us and set us free because of who we are. And who we are is his creation. And he just simply loves you for who you are, not what you do. He is showing you kindness, me kindness, by what he's done on the cross. And he's showing you and I kindness in this moment of wanting to commune with us. In just a moment, I'm going to invite you to go get your little communion packets. If you didn't get one when you walked in, they're next to the giving boxes by the tables there. The little packet has a little wafer symbolic of his body broken on the cross, and the little juice is symbolic of his blood shed. And you bring it back, you sit down, and you have this moment. You just close your eyes and you just breathe. Just breathe. And just picture yourself sitting at the table with Jesus. You might be tempted to say all these things about how horrible you are and how much you just stink as a person. And if you feel the need